The Phantom Bride. Hello friends, welcome to the Horror Ghost Stories. The story begins. It was a quiet evening in the small town of Riverview. The streets were dimly lit by old street lamps, their flickering lights casting long shadows on the cobblestone paths. A thick fog rolled in from the river, swallowing up the world beyond it. Most of the townsfolk had already retreated into their homes, leaving behind the eerie silence that often preceded something unnatural. The legend of the Phantom Bride had been told in whispers for decades. People spoke of a young woman who had tragically died on the night of her wedding. Her fiancé, heartbroken and desperate, was said to have cursed the world with her spirit, vowing that she would never rest until her love was avenged. Now, it was said that she appeared on the night of the full moon, wandering the town in search of the one who had wronged her. For years, the town had been content to dismiss the tale as nothing more than superstition. But that all changed one cold winter evening. It started with the disappearance of Emily Rogers, a young woman engaged to a local man named Tom. She vanished without a trace, and the only clue left behind was a single, red rose found in the middle of her bedroom floor, untouched by time or decay. Rumors spread quickly that Emily had become the Phantom Bride, the spirit of the lost bride, and that she had come to claim another victim. Tom was beside himself with grief, searching for Emily everywhere, from the quiet woods by the river to the abandoned chapel on the hill. He refused to believe she was dead. His love for her was as strong as it had ever been, and he knew she had to be out there, waiting for him to save her. Weeks passed, and the town began to grow uneasy. Strange things began to happen. People reported seeing a figure in white wandering the streets at night, a woman in a tattered bridal gown, her face hidden behind a veil. They said her eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and her mournful cry could be heard echoing through the fog. Some claimed to have seen her standing in the windows of empty houses, others said she appeared at the foot of their beds in the middle of the night, her cold hand brushing their faces before disappearing into the shadows. Tom, however, was undeterred. He spent countless nights searching, hoping to find some trace of his beloved. But as the days passed, something began to change within him. His obsession grew stronger, and a darkness began to take root in his heart. He had heard the warnings of the townsfolk, their stories about the curse of the Phantom Bride, but he refused to listen. Emily was out there, and he would stop at nothing to find her. One night, under the full moon, Tom ventured into the forest that bordered the town. The air was thick with fog, and the trees groaned under the weight of their snow-covered branches. He moved deeper into the woods, the sounds of his footsteps muffled by the thick blanket of snow that had fallen overnight. The deeper he went, the colder it became. The trees seemed to close in around him, their twisted branches casting long shadows that stretched across the ground. His breath hung in the air like smoke, and the silence was suffocating. Then, as if summoned by his desperation, he heard a sound, a soft sobbing, distant yet unmistakable. His heart skipped a beat as he followed the sound, his footsteps quickening with anticipation. Through the mist, he saw her. A figure dressed in white, standing at the edge of a small clearing. Her back was to him, but there was no mistaking who she was. Emily. Her once beautiful gown was now ragged and torn, her long, dark hair cascading down her back like a tangled mess. Her body was thin, almost ghostly, and her skin was pale as death. "Emily!" Tom called, his voice breaking through the silence of the forest. She turned slowly, and Tom's blood ran cold. Her face was a mask of sorrow and pain, but her eyes were not those of the woman he had once loved. They were hollow, black pits, filled with an emptiness that seemed to draw him in, threatening to swallow him whole. "Tom," she whispered, her voice a haunting echo. "Why did you leave me? Why did you abandon me?" "I never left you, Emily," Tom cried, rushing toward her. "I searched for you. I've never stopped loving you." But as he reached out to touch her, she stepped back, her form flickering like a shadow in the moonlight. "You should have saved me," she said, her voice now cold and distant. "But you failed. You abandoned me just like he did. And now, you will pay the price." Tom's heart raced. He reached for her again, desperate to hold her, to make things right. But before he could touch her, she let out a scream, sharp and high-pitched, echoing through the trees. The ground beneath Tom's feet trembled, and the air turned ice-cold. From the shadows, other figures began to emerge, dozens of them, all women in tattered bridal gowns. Their faces were hidden beneath veils, their eyes glowing with the same unnatural light as Emily's. They surrounded Tom, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes pulled by invisible strings. "You will never escape," Emily's voice echoed, now all around him. "You will never be free of me." With a sudden, terrifying force, the women lunged at Tom, their cold hands grabbing at his arms and legs. He screamed, struggling to break free, but their grip was unyielding. As they pulled him toward the ground, Emily's figure loomed over him, her face twisted in agony. "You are mine now, Tom," she whispered, her voice chilling. "Forever." The ground beneath them cracked open, and the forest seemed to come alive with a malevolent energy. The fog thickened, and the whispers of the phantom bride grew louder, drowning out Tom's screams. The next morning, the town of Riverview was still and quiet, as if nothing had happened. The fog had lifted, and the sun had risen, casting a pale light over the town. But in the woods, a new legend was born. Tom's body was never found, and Emily's spirit continued to wander the earth, searching for her lost love. The town, once filled with hope and life, had become a place of fear, where no one dared to walk the streets at night. And as the full moon rose once again, the phantom bride returned to claim another soul. This can continue with new victims, mysterious occurrences, and deeper explorations of the town's haunted past. As the months passed, the legend of the phantom bride only grew stronger. Whispers of Tom's disappearance became just another part of the town's dark history, a grim reminder of the curse that hung over Riverview. The townsfolk began to live in fear, avoiding the woods, never venturing out after sunset, and always glancing over their shoulders, half expecting to see a pale, veiled figure lurking in the shadows. However, one group of young friends, undeterred by the stories that plagued the town, decided to test the legend. They were skeptical, dismissive of ghost tales, and eager to prove the town's fears were born from superstition and old wives' tales. Among them was Lucy, a determined and brave young woman who had lived in Riverview all her life. She had heard the stories about the phantom bride since she was a child, but she had never believed them. Her skepticism led her to challenge the others to join her on a daring midnight adventure into the woods, straight to the very heart of the legend. On a crisp autumn night, under a moon shrouded by clouds, Lucy and her friends made their way toward the forest's edge, where the fog had begun to roll in. Their hearts raced with excitement and nervousness, but they laughed it off, eager to prove the stories wrong. "We'll get to the chapel and back in no time," Lucy said confidently as they crossed the threshold into the misty trees. "It's all nonsense. Ghosts don't exist." But the deeper they ventured into the woods, the more the air grew heavy, the silence more oppressive. Even the sounds of their footsteps seemed muffled, swallowed by the thick fog that twisted between the gnarled branches of ancient trees. As they approached the chapel, the same one where Tom had searched in vain for Emily all those months ago, an unsettling chill crept down their spines. The once beautiful structure had become a rotting ruin, its stained glass windows cracked, its doors hanging off their hinges. The place where hope had died now felt like a tomb, a dark echo of lost love. "Let us not stay long, Sarah," one of Lucy's friends said nervously. "I don't like this place." But Lucy pressed on, determined to show everyone there was nothing to fear. They stepped inside the dilapidated chapel, the air thick with decay and the smell of mildew. As they explored the crumbling pews and rotting altar, they couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them, just out of sight. Without warning, the door slammed shut behind them, cutting off their only escape. Panic rippled through the group. Lucy's heart pounded in her chest as she turned to the others. What the hell was that? Before anyone could answer, a cold wind blew through the chapel, extinguishing their lanterns and plunging them into darkness. The temperature dropped sharply, and the whispers began soft at first, like the rustling of leaves, but then clearer, unmistakable. "Leave." The voice was faint, but it was there, low, melodic, and filled with sorrow. It seemed to come from all around them, echoing off the stone walls. "That's just the wind," Lucy said, her voice shaky despite her bravado. But even she couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread settling over her. The whispers grew louder, now accompanied by the faint sound of footsteps, soft and slow, yet unmistakably there. A figure appeared in the far corner of the chapel, half hidden in the shadows. A woman, dressed in a wedding gown. Her hair was dark, matted with dirt and leaves, and her veil hung low over her face. For a moment, no one could move. They stood frozen, eyes locked on the apparition. Lucy's heart raced, and her breath came in shallow gasps. This couldn't be real, this had to be some sort of prank. But as the figure stepped forward, her veil lifted just enough to reveal her face. The woman's skin was deathly pale, her eyes hollow, black holes where light should have been. Her mouth was twisted in a twisted, mournful smile, her lips cracked and bleeding. Her eyes locked onto Lucy's, and the young woman's body went cold with terror. There was no doubt now. This was no prank. This was the Phantom Bride. Lucy backed away, but the woman's gaze held her in place, her feet seemingly glued to the floor. The other friends screamed, scrambling toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. The figure moved closer, her steps slow, deliberate, like the ticking of a clock counting down to doom. "You shouldn't have come," the Phantom Bride whispered, her voice barely audible but chilling in its finality. "You are all part of the curse now." The air in the chapel thickened, suffocating, as the temperature dropped even further. The ground beneath their feet seemed to vibrate, as though something ancient and malevolent was waking. Shadows gathered at the edges of the room, forming into figures more women, all dressed in the same tattered bridal gowns. They emerged from the walls, from the floor, their eyes glowing with that same sickening light. The figures reached for the group, their skeletal hands extending like claws. Lucy screamed, her voice drowned out by the chorus of wails that filled the chapel. Her friends tried to run, but the room seemed to twist, disorienting them, trapping them within its cursed walls. The cold grew unbearable, seeping into their bones, making every movement feel as though they were wading through a dense, icy fog. The women in the bridal gowns closed in on them, their whispers blending into a cacophony of agony. "Why did you leave me?" one of them wailed, her voice cracking. "Why did you abandon me?" the others joined in, repeating the words in a chorus of sorrow and rage. Lucy fought against the invisible force pressing down on her chest. "We didn't." But her words were cut off as the phantom bride stepped forward, her hand reaching for Lucy's throat. Her touch was icy, like death itself, and Lucy could feel the life draining from her, the overwhelming sense of despair closing in. The other figures crowded closer, their eyes fixed on the group, as though they were watching them all descend into the same fate. "Now, you will join us," the phantom bride whispered. "Forever." With a final, desperate cry, Lucy reached for the door, managing to pry it open just a crack before the figures lunged at her. The door slammed shut again, and everything went black. The next morning, the townsfolk found the chapel abandoned, the door wide open as if it had been left in haste. Inside, there was no sign of Lucy or her friends. All that remained were the faint, haunting whispers of the phantom bride, carried on the wind. The fog never truly lifted from the town of Riverview again. And though no one could prove what happened to Lucy and the others, there was one truth that everyone knew: the phantom bride would always return, and no one who ventured into the woods at night would ever escape her curse. The town had become a place of sorrow, where the echoes of the past continued to haunt the living, and the legend of the phantom bride grew ever more powerful. And with each passing year, as the moon grew full and the fog began to roll in, the town would wait, ever fearful, for the next soul the phantom bride would claim. The end.